Caleb Thorne woke to the sound he always dreaded most. Silence, not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but the hollow, muffled silence that meant his damaged hearing had worsened overnight. He sat up in his rough bunk, pressing his palms against his ears and releasing them, hoping the pressure change would help. It didn't. The logging accident 3 years ago had crushed the left side of the skull and left him with hearing that came and went like an unreliable friend. On bad days, the world sounded like he was underwater. On worse days, like today, he heard almost nothing at all. Caleb was 7 feet of solid muscle and hardened experience, a man who could fell a tree with a dozen axe strokes, but this silence made him feel small and broken. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside into the Wyoming dawn, not yet knowing that this would be the day everything changed, the day a desperate woman's whispered words would be lost in the space between what she meant and what he heard. If you're drawn to stories about misunderstanding, redemption, and the unexpected connections that change lives forever, subscribe now because this journey will leave you breathless. The frost was thick on the ground as Caleb began his morning routine, checking his traps along the creek that ran through his property. He lived 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Graybull, far enough that he could go weeks without seeing another human face. That was exactly how he preferred it. People spoke too quietly, got frustrated when he asked them to repeat things, treated him like he was simple-minded just because he couldn't always hear them. Out here, the only conversations he needed were with the trees, and the silence didn't judge him. He was walking the ridge above his cabin when he saw smoke rising from the old trapper's shelter about 2 miles west. The cabin had been abandoned for years, slowly falling apart under Wyoming's harsh weather. Caleb stopped, watching the thin column of smoke with suspicion. Drifters sometimes used the place, and not all of them were friendly. He considered ignoring it, heading back to his own business. But something made him change direction and head toward the smoke. As he approached the cabin, Caleb saw a horse tied outside, thin and exhausted looking. The door was slightly ajar, and even with his damaged hearing, he could sense something was wrong. The air felt heavy with distress. He pushed the door open slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. What he found inside made him freeze in the doorway. A young woman lay on the cabin's single cot, her face pale and slick with sweat despite the cold. She couldn't have been more than 25, with blonde hair plastered to her forehead and eyes that looked through him rather than at him. Her dress was torn and stained, and even from across the room Caleb could see she was heavily pregnant. Very pregnant, dangerously pregnant. Near the cold fireplace lay a man's body, partially covered with a blanket. Caleb could see enough to know the man had been dead for days, his chest torn open by what looked like bear claws. The woman on the cot let out a low moan, her back arching, and Caleb suddenly understood what he had walked into. The woman's eyes focused on him for a moment, and she tried to speak. Her lips moved, forming words, but Caleb's damaged ears caught only fragments. He moved closer, kneeling beside the cot. "Help," he thought she said, though he wasn't certain. "Please help." Caleb felt panic rising in his chest. He knew nothing about childbirth, nothing about medicine, nothing about how to help this suffering woman. The nearest doctor was in Graybull, hours away by horse. He looked at her desperate face and made a decision. He would ride for help, bring back the doctor, bring back women who would know what to do. The woman reached out and grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Her mouth moved again, speaking words he strained to hear. He caught fragments, broken pieces. "The baby!" Something about the baby. "Coming," he thought she said. "Soon." Caleb tried to explain that he would get help, but he wasn't sure if his own words were coming out right. Speaking was harder when he couldn't hear himself properly. He gestured toward the door, toward where his horse was tied, trying to indicate he would return. The woman's grip tightened. She was trying to tell him something urgent. Her face contorted with pain, and she gasped out words that Caleb leaned close to hear. "Keep going," she whispered, her voice barely reaching him through the fog of his damaged hearing. "Keep going." Caleb interpreted this as encouragement. She was telling him to go, to hurry, to keep going and get help. He nodded, squeezed her hand once to show he understood, and stood up. The woman's eyes widened, and she tried to say something else, but another contraction hit. and her words dissolved into a cry of pain that Caleb felt more than heard. He ran from the cabin, mounted his horse, and rode hard toward Graybull. Behind him, Rose Whitfield screamed words into the empty cabin, words that would haunt both of them. She hadn't been telling him to leave. She had been begging him to stay, to keep going with her through the labor, to not abandon her the way death had abandoned her, with her husband's body growing cold on the floor. Caleb rode like he had never ridden before, pushing his horse to the edge of his endurance across the frozen Wyoming terrain. The journey to Graybull normally took 4 hours at a steady pace, but Caleb was determined to make it in 3. He leaned low over his horse's neck, his mind filled with the image of that desperate woman's face, her whispered words that he had taken as encouragement to hurry. Keep going, keep going. He was doing exactly what she had asked, wasn't he? Racing to get help, to bring back people who could save her and her baby. The sun was climbing higher when Caleb finally thundered into Graybull's main street, his horse lathered and heaving. People stopped and stared at the giant man who rarely came to town, never mind arriving at a full gallop. Caleb pulled up in front of Dr. Warren's office and practically fell from his saddle, his legs stiff from the hard ride. He pounded on the doctor's door with enough force to rattle the frame. When the elderly physician opened it, looking annoyed at the disturbance, Caleb struggled to form words, unable to hear his own voice properly, unsure if he was shouting or whispering. Woman, he said, the word feeling strange in his mouth. Cabin, baby coming, husband dead, need help now. Dr. Warren's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. He grabbed Caleb's arm and spoke, his mouth moving carefully. Caleb caught some of it. How far? The doctor was asking. How long ago did you leave her? 2 hours, Caleb said, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was right. Time had become elastic during the frantic ride. Maybe longer. The doctor's face paled. He turned and shouted something into his house. A moment later, his wife appeared, along with 2 other women Caleb vaguely recognized from previous town visits. They moved with urgent efficiency, gathering supplies, blankets, medical instruments. Dr. Warren pulled Caleb aside and spoke directly to him, enunciating carefully so Caleb could read his lips. You left her alone, the doctor said, and it wasn't a question, for over 2 hours. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. She told me to keep going, he said defensively. She wanted me to get help. Dr. Warren closed his eyes briefly, and Caleb saw something like pity cross the old man's face. Son, he said slowly, making sure Caleb would see every word. When a woman in labor says keep going, she means keep going through contractions with her. She was asking you to stay. The world seemed to tilt beneath Caleb's feet. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't been encouraging him to leave. She had been begging him to stay. And he had abandoned her at the moment she needed help most, left her alone with her pain and fear and her dead husband's body, all because his damaged ears had betrayed him again. We need to go now, Dr. Warren said, already moving toward his wagon. But Caleb, you need to prepare yourself. 2 hours alone in active labor, especially if there are complications. We might be too late. The journey back felt infinitely longer than the ride to town. Dr. Warren drove the wagon as fast as the terrain allowed, his wife and the 2 other women holding on grimly. Caleb rode alongside, his mind torturing him with images of what might have happened in his absence. The woman dying alone, the baby dying, both of them gone because he hadn't understood, because his broken ears had turned a plea for help into permission to leave. When they finally reached the trapper's cabin, Caleb was off his horse before it fully stopped. He burst through the door, terrified of what he would find. The scene that greeted him was not what he expected. The woman, Rose, was still alive. She sat propped against the wall, exhausted but breathing, her face streaked with tears and sweat. And in her arms, wrapped in what looked like pieces of her own torn dress, was a baby, a small, red-faced baby that was crying with remarkable vigor. Dr. Warren and his wife rushed past Caleb, immediately beginning their examination. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process what he was seeing. She had done it, alone. She had delivered her own baby in this freezing cabin with no help, no support, nothing but her own desperate strength. Rose's eyes found Caleb's across the room. He saw anger there and hurt and exhaustion so profound it seemed to emanate from her very bones. But he also saw something else, something that might have been understanding. Dr. Warren's wife was speaking to Rose, asking questions, checking the baby. Rose answered, her voice too quiet for Caleb to hear. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Dr. Warren approached Caleb. Both mother and baby are alive, he said, speaking clearly so Caleb could understand. That's something close to a miracle. The baby is small but healthy. Rose has lost blood and is weak, but she should recover with proper care and rest. Relief flooded through Caleb, so intense it made him dizzy. They're going to be all right, he said, needing to hear the confirmation again. For now, the doctor said. But Caleb, she shouldn't be moved for at least a week. This cabin is barely standing and poorly insulated. She and the baby need warmth, proper food, constant care. He looked at Caleb significantly. Your cabin is closer than town, and larger, if you're willing. Caleb understood what the doctor was suggesting. Take them home, care for them, make up for the mistake that had nearly cost them everything. Yes, he said without hesitation. Whatever they need. Dr. Warren's wife, Martha, came over. She's asking for you, she said to Caleb, gesturing toward Rose. Caleb approached the cot slowly, feeling like he was walking toward judgment. Rose looked up at him, the baby still cradled against her chest. Up close, Caleb could see she was younger than he had first thought, probably not even 25. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and direct. She spoke, and Caleb moved closer, trying desperately to hear. Thank you, he thought she said, for getting help. I'm sorry, Caleb replied, the words feeling completely inadequate. I thought you wanted me to go. I didn't understand. I should have stayed. Rose's expression softened slightly. You couldn't hear me, she said, speaking more clearly now, probably coached by Martha. I understand that now. You did what you thought was right. It was almost right, Caleb said bitterly. Rose studied Caleb's face for a long moment. Seeing the genuine remorse there, the self-recrimination that matched her own earlier terror and anger, she was too exhausted to hold on to fury, too grateful to be alive to waste energy on blame. Her husband was dead, killed by a bear while checking their trap lines 5 days ago. She had been alone since then, growing weaker, knowing the baby was coming, unable to ride for help in her condition. When this giant stranger had appeared in the doorway like an answer to desperate prayers, she had tried to beg him to stay, and when he left instead, she had felt abandoned by God himself. But she had survived anyway. Somehow, through pain that felt like it would tear her apart, through fear that threatened to drown her, she had brought her daughter into the world. When the baby's first cry had filled the cabin, Rose had wept with relief, so profound it felt like a physical presence. My husband, Rose said now, looking past Caleb toward the blanket-covered form by the fireplace. He needs to be buried properly. Caleb nodded. I'll take care of it, he said. Before we move you to my cabin, I'll see to it that he's laid to rest with respect. Over the next few hours, while Dr. Warren and the women tended to Rose and the baby, Caleb dug a grave on a small rise overlooking the valley. The ground was partially frozen, making the work brutal, but Caleb welcomed the physical pain. It gave him something to focus on besides his crushing guilt. He carved a simple marker from a piece of pine, burning the name Rose quietly provided into the wood. Daniel Whitfield, beloved husband. The burial was brief and somber. Rose insisted on attending despite her weakness, leaning heavily on Martha Warren's arm. She held her baby daughter close as Dr. Warren said a few words over the grave. Caleb stood apart, feeling like an intruder on this intimate grief. When it was done, Rose placed a small bundle of pine branches on the fresh earth and whispered something too quiet for Caleb to hear. The journey to Caleb's cabin was slow and careful. They made a sort of litter by stretching blankets between two poles, carrying Rose as gently as possible while she held the baby. Caleb led the way, checking constantly to make sure the path was smooth enough. The 2-mile journey took over an hour. When they arrived at Caleb's cabin, he felt suddenly self-conscious about its rough simplicity. It was built for function, not comfort. One large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs, shelves holding basic supplies. But it was solid and warm, and that was what mattered now. Martha Warren immediately began organizing, directing the other women to set up a proper bed area for Rose near the fireplace. They hung blankets to create a private space, arranged clean linens, built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. Dr. Warren examined both Rose and the baby again, declaring himself cautiously optimistic about their recovery. Before the townspeople left, Dr. Warren pulled Caleb aside. "She'll need care for at least 2 weeks," he said. "Regular meals, help with the baby, someone to watch for signs of fever or excessive bleeding. Can you manage that?" "Yes," Caleb said firmly. "I'll take care of them." The doctor studied him for a moment. "You're a good man, Caleb Thorne. Don't let one misunderstanding convince you otherwise." Then he and the others climbed into the wagon and headed back toward Grey Bull, leaving Caleb alone with his unexpected responsibilities. The first few days were awkward beyond description. Rose was weak and recovering, needing help with basic tasks that made both of them uncomfortable. Caleb tried to be useful while respecting her privacy, bringing water and food, keeping the fire going, changing soiled linens while averting his eyes. Communication was difficult. Rose quickly learned to speak clearly and face him directly, so he could read her lips, but there were still misunderstandings that led to frustration on both sides. The baby, whom Rose named Sarah after her own mother, cried frequently and loudly. Caleb found that he could feel the vibrations of her cries, even when he couldn't hear them clearly. He would wake in the night to see Rose struggling to calm the infant, exhausted beyond measure, and he felt helpless to assist with something so delicate and vital. On the 4th night, Caleb woke to unusual silence. He climbed down from his loft and saw Rose sitting by the fire, rocking a sleeping Sarah, tears streaming silently down her face. Caleb approached carefully and sat across from her, waiting. When Rose finally looked at him, she spoke clearly despite her tears. "I don't know how to do this alone," she said. "Daniel and we had plans. We were going to build a ranch, raise our family together. He was supposed to be here. And instead I have a stranger taking care of us out of guilt, living in a cabin that isn't ours, completely dependent on charity. How did everything go so wrong?" Caleb wanted to say something comforting, but struggled to find words. Finally he spoke, unsure if his volume was right. "It's not charity," he said, "and you're not alone. I know I'm not who you wanted here, not who should be here, but I am here, and I'll help you as long as you need it." Rose wiped her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "You don't owe me anything. You tried to help. It's not your fault your hearing is damaged." "Maybe not," Caleb said, "but I left you when you needed someone most. Even if it was a mistake, even if I didn't understand, that's still what happened. I can't change that, but I can try to make things right going forward." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling fire and Sarah's soft breathing. Then Rose spoke again, her voice gentler now. "Tell me about your accident," she said. "How you lost your hearing." Caleb hesitated, then found himself telling the story he rarely shared. How he had been working a logging site in Montana, how a massive tree had fallen wrong and caught him against another trunk, crushing the side of his head. How he had woken days later with constant ringing in his ears and sound that came and went unpredictably. How people had treated him differently afterward, like he was broken or stupid. How he had retreated to this isolated place where his disability didn't matter because there was no one around to misunderstand or judge. "It must be lonely," Rose observed. It was, Caleb admitted. Until now, over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. The awkwardness between Caleb and Rose gradually transformed into a comfortable routine. They developed a system of communication that worked despite his hearing loss. Rose learned to tap his shoulder before speaking, to face him directly, to use gestures when words weren't enough. Caleb learned to anticipate her needs, to read her expressions, to help without being asked. Sarah grew stronger each day, her tiny face filling out, her cries becoming more demanding. Caleb discovered that he wasn't as helpless with the baby as he had feared. He could hold her while Rose rested, could walk her around the cabin when she was fussy, could even change her wrappings without complete disaster. The first time Sarah fell asleep against his massive chest, her tiny fist curled against his shirt, Caleb felt something crack open inside him that he hadn't known was closed. Rose regained her strength slowly but steadily. She insisted on helping with cabin tasks as soon as she was able, cooking meals, mending clothes, organizing Caleb's chaotic shelves into something resembling order. She had a practical efficiency that Caleb admired, a determination not to be a burden despite her circumstances. One evening, as they sat by the fire after Sarah had fallen asleep, Rose brought up the subject they had both been avoiding. "I need to make plans," she said. "I can't stay here forever. It's not fair to you." "Where would you go?" Caleb asked, though the question made his chest tight with emotion he didn't want to examine too closely. Rose stared into the flames. "I don't know," she admitted. "Daniel and I came from Ohio. His family disowned him for marrying me. My own family died when I was young. We came west to start fresh, to build something of our own. But the land claim was in his name. Without him, I have no legal right to it. And even if I did, I couldn't work it alone with a baby. You could stay here," Caleb said, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. "There's room. I could build an addition to the cabin, make separate spaces. You and Sarah would be safe." Rose turned to look at him directly. "Caleb, that's incredibly generous. But people would talk. A widow living with an unmarried man. It would damage both our reputations." "I don't care what people say," Caleb replied. "I stopped caring about that years ago when they started treating me like I was simple because I can't always hear them. But I care," Rose said firmly. "Not for myself, but for Sarah. She'll grow up in this territory. I won't have her childhood shadowed by gossip about her mother's impropriety." Caleb understood her concern, but the thought of them leaving, of this cabin returning to its former empty silence, was unbearable. "Then marry me," he said. Rose stared at him, clearly shocked. "What did you say?" "Marry me," Caleb repeated, more certain now. "Not for love or romance, but as a practical arrangement. You need security and a home. I need," he paused, searching for honesty, "I need not to be alone anymore. This isn't a fairy tale proposal. It's a partnership. We help each other. We raise Sarah together. We build something stable." Rose was quiet for a long time, her expression unreadable. "That's possibly the least romantic proposal in history," she finally said, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "I know," Caleb admitted, "but it's honest. I won't pretend to be something I'm not or offer you something I can't give. What I can give is safety, a home, hard work, and loyalty. That has to be enough or it's not." Rose looked at Sarah sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle. "Daniel's been gone less than 2 months," she said quietly. "People will say I didn't mourn him properly, that I moved on too quickly. People will say things no matter what you do," Caleb pointed out. "At least this way you'll have legal protection and a home for your daughter. We can wait a respectful time if that matters to you. But the offer stands." Rose met his eyes. "You really mean this, don't you? You'd take on another man's child, bind yourself to a woman you barely know, just to help us?" "It's not just for you," Caleb said honestly. "It's for me too. These past weeks, having you and Sarah here, it's reminded me what it feels like to have purpose beyond just surviving. I don't want to go back to what I was before." Rose stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. When she turned back, her expression was resolute. "All right," she said. "Yes, but with conditions. We take time to truly know each other first. We build separate sleeping areas. And if either of us becomes unhappy with the arrangement, we're honest about it and find another solution." "Agreed," Caleb said, relief washing through him. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Graybull. The townspeople attended with mixed expressions of approval and suspicion. Martha Warren cried happy tears and insisted it was the most practical romance she had ever witnessed. Dr. Warren gave Caleb a knowing look that suggested he understood this was about more than mere practicality, even if the couple themselves weren't ready to admit it. Caleb built the promised addition to the cabin, creating a private bedroom for Rose and Sarah, while he kept the law for himself. The arrangement was respectful and proper, exactly as they had agreed. But as spring arrived and the Wyoming landscape transformed from frozen white to vibrant green, the emotional landscape between them began shifting too. Caleb found himself listening for Rose's laughter, found excuses to be near her, noticed how the sunlight caught in her hair. Rose found herself watching Caleb work, admiring his quiet competence, feeling her heart warm when he played with Sarah with such gentle care. Neither spoke of these developing feelings, both hesitant to complicate their practical arrangement with messy emotions. Then one evening in late spring, as they worked together to plant a garden behind the cabin, Sarah sleeping in a basket nearby, Rose suddenly stopped digging and looked at Caleb. "I need to tell you something," she said. Caleb set down his shovel, concerned by her serious tone. "What is it?" "I've been lying to myself," Rose said. "This arrangement, this partnership we created, I told myself it was enough, that companionship and security were sufficient. But the truth is, I've fallen in love with you, Caleb Thorne, and I don't know what to do about it." Caleb felt his heart hammering in his chest. "I've been lying to myself too," he admitted. "I told myself I was doing this out of guilt and loneliness. But somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my world. You and Sarah both. I love you, Rose. I think I have for weeks." Rose smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "So what do we do now?" "We stopped treating this like a business arrangement," Caleb said, crossing the space between them. "We acknowledge that this is real, that we're a real family, that what we have is worth more than practicality." He pulled her close, and they kissed as the sun set over the Wyoming mountains, Sarah sleeping peacefully nearby, the garden half planted around them. It wasn't how either of them had imagined their lives would unfold, but it was real and honest and built on a foundation of mutual respect and growing love. Years later, when Sarah was old enough to ask about how her parents met, they told her the truth, about the misunderstanding that had nearly ended in tragedy, about the practical arrangement that became genuine love, about how sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult circumstances. Sarah listened with wide eyes and declared it the most romantic story she had ever heard, which always made Caleb and Rose laugh. They built a good life together in that Wyoming cabin. Caleb continued his lumber work, but now he came home each evening to warmth and laughter. Rose created a thriving garden and eventually started taking in sewing work from women in Graybull. Sarah grew into a strong, confident young woman who inherited her mother's practicality and her father's quiet strength. And every year on the anniversary of that confused dawn when Caleb had misunderstood Rose's desperate plea, they held each other close and acknowledged how easily everything could have gone differently, how grateful they were for second chances, and how the most profound connections could emerge from the deepest misunderstandings. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that our greatest mistakes can sometimes lead to our greatest blessings. Leave a comment about which moment resonated most with you. Your support helps me continue creating these stories about resilience, second chances, and the unexpected paths to love. Thank you for being here. And remember that communication takes many forms, that disability doesn't diminish worth, and that sometimes what seems like the worst moment of our lives is actually the doorway to something beautiful. Stay compassionate, stay open, and never underestimate the healing power of choosing to stay when everything tells you to run.